choices can impact our preferences, our conceptual associations, our habits of preference, which influence our perceptions. At any given point in time, when we are presented with a choice, we must first deal with our limited capacity to perceive. We can only perceive so much information in so much time. And while our capacity to perceive is certainly remarkable, we can perceive a lot of information in a very little amount of time, there are limitations. There are limitations. Much as there is a temporal limitation, only so much information in so much time, as there is a spatial limitation, we cannot directly perceive that which is not immediately presented to us. We have a limitation imposed on our capacity to perceive and for our perceptions to have meaningful impact on our decisions based on relative velocity. That being the difference between the speed at which we perceive circumstance and the speed at which circumstance changes. It could be hypothetically possible, if we were dealing with a static problem, to perceive it in its entirety. It is hypothetically possible for us to perceive it in its entirety if it was remaining absolutely still. It's not. No circumstance is perfectly static, is entirely static. And so not only are we trying to perceive the aspects of the problem as they exist, we are trying to play catch-up to the changes that are occurring in the problem as we're going about the process of perception. So efficiency is very important, especially if we are going to have our choices have any correlation to the circumstance. If we, for example, spend so much time perceiving, so much time trying to comprehend and apprehend the circumstances of the choice, chances are that they are going to change meaningfully before we actually reach a decision. So, in order for there to be even a loose correlation between our decisions and the context in which we were making the decision, or the problem that we were attempting to address with our decision, we have to do so relatively quickly. And one of the primary ways that we do this is through efficiency in our perception. One of the chief devices that we use to streamline the process of perception is preference. Now, preferences work both ways. There are things that we preferentially seek to bring about. There are things that we preferentially seek to avoid. And since the process of perception in any decision problem is going to be investigatory, we're not just sitting back and passively receiving information, we are actively seeking it out. Our preferences can serve as a good working criteria for what it is we are going to perceive as a possible option in a problem. We're going to seek out options based on our preferences. Now this gets tricky because our preferences are in some way related to or concerned with choices that we have made in the past. Our preferences are at least partially formed and informed by recalling previous consequences to our decisions, and especially previous associations. We can recall, we remember that I had this need, I sought this solution, it brought about this consequence which did or did not address the need. This is one of the ways in which our preferences are formed. Our preferences are also very much concerned with identity. We will preferentially seek out options which we feel reflect this aspect of our identity, that aspect of our identity. It's one of the ways in which we actively self-define. Preferences are also concerned with, and I would say in some degree, a reflection of innate aspects of identity. Those things which are intrinsic to our identity that we did not necessarily define, and which we do not necessarily have the capacity to define. Innate needs, food, shelter, this sort of thing. The biological drive. Now, in a view that does not take God into account or does not view God as existent, identity and preferences, and especially the relationship between them, are not purely self-definitive, are not entirely in our ability to define by virtue of universal elements of psychology and physiology. In the Christian context, identity cannot be purely self-defined because we are not self-creating, and we were created with intent. Intentionality has imposed certain characteristics above and beyond universal psychology and universal physiology. And I would say that the Christian needs to, in their account and their idea of identity and preference, take into account the universal elements of psychology and physiology. The Christian needs to account for the atheistic view as well. Now, because there are aspects of our identity, preferences, and the relationship between them that are not entirely in our ability to define, we cannot freely or absolutely define these things, there are some factors in identity. There are some factors in the way that identity plays out and the way that identity shapes our choices that are ultimately irrevocable. And because of this, our self-definition, those aspects of our identity that we can freely define, and the innate identity, those aspects of identity that we cannot freely define, these may come into conflict. And they may come into conflict in such a way that they are mutually destructive. And here we have, possibly, a working functional definition for sin. Now, at this point, I'm going to set aside most of the remaining philosophical problems posed by this definition and move into the theological ones. Again, we're working in very broad strokes here. Now, in a purely Christian context, some may object to my describing human will as capable of good choices, and I would say that probably even more will object to my proposing that self is a thing to be cultivated. Why is this so? That is because that modern Christian thought, especially in the Western world, especially in regions that are predominantly Protestant, the idea of absolute depravity is critical to Christian thinking. Absolute depravity is a concept that was most clearly defined by Augustine of Hippo in his treatise City of God. Now, the idea in its essentials is that human will is inherently opposed to God by virtue of original sin, and that the human being is incapable of rightly choosing, or more relevant, rightly choosing obeisance or obedience to God.